Welcome to Codex History of Video Games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we have a guest. I'm so excited to have a
Oh,
guest
boy.
on the show. We actually have freelance journalist who has written for The Verge, Ars Technica, Wired, Business Insider, PC World, IGN, so many more. And they also have an amazing video game history YouTube channel called Computer Gaming Yesterday. Please help us welcome Matthew S. Smith. Thank you for being here, Matthew.
Yay.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be on the show.
I'm so excited. And today we're going to talk about kind of a general discussion of MMORPG history, right? Because we haven't really talked about it that much on the podcast. And you have some great videos out there. I watched your Dark Age of Camelot video. That was awesome. And then the Asheron's Call video. And I also watched Baldur's Gate 2, the video you did on that as well. That's not an MMORPG, but I was like, look at this. Yeah, it's great. So just kind of a general discussion about MMOs and kind of how they started. And we're really talking pre-World of Warcraft. We might get into a little bit of that later, but we're talking pre-World of Warcraft.
Ancient history,
pre-Blizzard. Well, not pre-Blizzard, but pre-World of Warcraft. Okay, so I guess the first question I have for you, because you briefly touch on it in the Dark Age of Camelot video I watched, is the mud.
Wallowing in the mud,
the multi-user dungeon. So if you could just kind of go over, like, for people who don't know, what is a mud? And then, like, was there a first mud?
Yeah, the first mud was called, and wait for it, this is gonna shock you, it was called Mud. Well, and also oftentimes referred to as Mud 1, with mud literally meaning multi-user dungeon. It was a very practical name, very descriptive name, but back in, what was it, 1979, I think, when it first was like playable, it was very revolutionary, and the people that were doing it were probably more on the coding and computer science side than on the creative side. So we got Mud. And then Mud, of course, became the name for the entire genre of text-based online multiplayer games, which ended up proliferating and spawning, I think it's not an exaggeration to say, thousands of Muds over the following 2 decades.
Wow. What kind of system would that first one run on? You said like late 70s. So like home computers I guess they exist.
I would have to check my notes on that. But it would be a mainframe style kind of system, like a timeshare kind of system, like a PDP-10 or maybe a deck or something like that, where you've got like one computer and a bunch of terminals that are connected to it, which was very common back in those days. It was the microcomputer revolution was just like on the cusp of happening, and but hadn't really happened yet. So that was how they would generally be played at that point. But very quickly, as like your Apple, your Atari systems, your Amiga systems and whatnot started to come out, and you started to see those personal computers start to actually become a thing. Of course, they generally were called to as like microcomputers back then. Then Mud started to become very common on microcomputers, and they were a really good fit because you didn't need a lot of graphics. There's also the text-based adventures, same thing. You don't have graphics, so they could actually run on the microcomputers that in the early days just basically had almost no graphical capabilities to speak of.
So this would be just like the role of the dungeon master is the computer telling you where you're at, and then you make choices via text, right? That's
I mean, that is literally how I believe it was thought of by a lot of people that were making Muds. And Muds were generally very derivative of tabletop role-playing systems, most particular Dungeons and Dragons, of course, but there was a lot of tabletop role-playing systems even back then that were starting to get traction. And it was, you had a computer that could be your dungeon master, and that meant you could play by yourself if you didn't have a group of people around, which I think was really important for a lot of early fans of both text adventures and Muds, because back in the early 80s, and this was true even for me, in like the late 80s and the 90s, like Dungeons and Dragons sounded really cool, but it wasn't always possible to get a group, you know. It was just starting to gain traction. So you could instead use the computer and have an adventure and not have to have like 5 other friends that live near you to come play Dungeons and Dragons with you, which sometimes could be quite an obstacle.
Still is an obstacle, to be honest.
It
scheduling
can be.
Scheduling's the real raid boss of Dungeons and Dragons. I think we can all agree. So here's another question then for you. Do you personally have a favorite MUD of yours?
So I don't. And the truth is that MUDs were really, they predated me.
Oh yeah.
I mean, like I got my first computer in 1996, early 1996. And that was really my first chance to have much of an experience with computers. My school had some Apple IIs, which if you do the math on that, this being the 90s, like those were not new computers.
Those are pretty old by then.
My school was not very well funded. So that was really not something that I had much of a chance to experience. I did mess around with some. I don't remember which ones exactly, because pretty quickly I was into, graphical games, which were starting to become a lot more popular. And the computer that I had some graphical capabilities. Do you remember Intel's Pentium MMX?
Yes, that was my first computer too.
Yeah.
My first PC.
Yeah, it was like
200 megahertz.
200 megahertz. Yes, exactly. That's what I had. It was a 200 megahertz Pentium MMX and a Sony. It was a Sony with the Trinitron monitor.
Ooh, I bet that monitor's still good today if you still have it.
I know. I wish we still had it. My family got rid of the old computers long time ago. But if I found one of those in decent condition for not hundreds and hundreds of dollars, which is the main problem, I would definitely snag it, but they're pretty pricey these days.
Yeah, people pay good money for a good Trinitron these days.
Yeah. So anyway, the MUDs are not something that I had a lot of experience with personally, but I have encountered them extensively in my research and read quite a bit about their history, because it does connect so directly with MMORPGs such as Dark Age of Camelot.
A MUD, like because I remember in your video about Dark Age of Camelot, you talked about how these computer scientist people essentially made MUDs, right? But then there's the server space issue. So they were doing this in their homes, right? They had like servers in their homes to start.
Right.
And then they were like, we gotta upgrade here.
And that's trying to get 8 phone lines hooked up to your house is like kind of weird.
Yeah.
That was so Mark Jacobs, who became lead figure of Mythic Entertainment, the creator of Dark Age of Camelot. He got his start with games. He got mad apparently at a MUD called Scepter of Goth, which was a very early one that was very popular. And he didn't I don't know exactly what, but they did some changes or something, typical like game player thing. Like they changed something. He didn't like it. So he's like, fine, I'm going to make my own MUD. And he made one called Aradath, and he ran it out of his home. And in order to do that, he needed to get a whole bunch of phone lines, and he had to convince the phone company to allow him to do it, because they thought it was really weird that a residential customer would want 20 phone lines so that 20 people could call in simultaneously. But that was the way that a lot of early MUDs were, especially the ones that were not associated with a university, because a lot of MUDs were associated with students at a university. But if that was not the case, then it was really like, if you wanted to run something like this, you needed a bunch of phone lines so people could dial in over a modem, directly over a phone line. And that was really the only way to do it. And the server was whatever computer, you got together that could run the MUD server infrastructure. And that was just it. And that was it for a long time. It took quite a while for the space to start to become more, in quotes, professional, and start to have some of the elements that we're more familiar with today.
Did they make money off of these MUDs? Was there money being made?
Yes. Apparently, Mark Jacobs, I have my notes up here. And let's see if I can quickly find it. I think it was $20 an hour was the one source I saw.
Holy moly.
Wow.
I'm just
Oh, no,
imagine
RDAT.
myself playing like World of Warcraft at $20 an hour. I'd be super broke.
A lot of people were. RDeath actually, so RDeath was actually a little different. The reference that this source I saw was $40 a month, which adjusting for a day of inflation is $115 a month today.
Wow.
Which actually like was kind of cheap. If Mark Jacob was running that like most of the life of that game on a monthly subscription, that actually was kind of cheap in a sense because a lot of companies were doing hourly. And so the $20 an hour price is from Dragon's Gate, which was a later MUD on the Genie network run by General Electric. And that one was $20 an hour around 1990-ish to log on and to play. And the prices decreased pretty rapidly, it should be said. Like they didn't stay that high for very long. But yeah, in the early days, if you wanted to play one of these games and you were not able to do it in, like I said, like a university environment where you had probably a network that was local to there or some kind of, let's say, subsidized access to online networking, and you were just doing it privately, it was very expensive to get online.
Wow. Yeah, that's just so nuts to think
because you were
about.
using phones, just like
Yeah.
regular phone lines, and it would be like you were doing a long distance call, basically. You know, it'd be something along those lines.
Yeah, I guess when you think about it from that perspective of like how much you would have paid to have a phone call that's that long, because that's it. You're doing at least that, right? You're at least having a phone call that's that long, and then on top of it, all the other computer stuff that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Now I just picture some poor kid who's into playing MUDs and he ties up his phone line at his parents' house for hours, and their bill comes in.
Oh, I bet that happened. I'm sure it
Yeah.
happened.
There's actually, so this is a funny story that I would like to get more details on, but there is I found this newspaper clipping from like 1980. It happened in like San Diego. There was a university student there that got in big trouble because he was calling into MUDs and other online games from the university network, and he rang up like many thousands of dollars in charges. And the university police ended up like investigating him, and he got arrested for something, for computer it was like computer wire fraud. It was like wire fraud or something like that. They got him. Wow. They tried to get him on some kind of telecommunications charge. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find any further reference as to like, did they actually go through with charging him? Was he convicted? What happened to this guy? His name was Sean S. Scott. So if anyone knows a Sean S. Scott that was referenced, they might have gotten in trouble with the law in 1980. Let me know. I'd love to hear more about that story.
We'll find him. You know, we asked our listeners about Kokomo, Indiana, and pinball bans, and we got a response. So we might, find out. Also, I hope he didn't go to prison, because then you'd have to tell everyone in prison why you're in prison, and it's because of
I know,
MUDs.
And it seems like such a weird thing, but like back at that time,
it's an odd crime.
It was a lot of money, and you know, the idea of people going online and playing these games is like, it's probably seemed very weird. It's like, what do you mean you're calling into like halfway across the country to like play a game on the computer?
Yeah,
and
right?
In fact, the article says like there's no signs there was any like fraud or like real theft here, because I think it was just, the assumption was like, oh, if this guy's just on the network calling across the country, he must be up to something nefarious. He's just wanted to play some games, man.
He just was pretending to be a wizard. Let it go. It's fine.
Just a real nerd, just trying to pretend.
What's funny to me is MUDs are still like alive and well today, though, because especially over COVID, my friends have a LARP group, and they created a MUD for their LARP group as like a way to like cover for the time, because they had to cancel all their live events. So people carried their characters over into this text-based MUD. And I was actually like DMing one of the encounters online, and it was like very intense for typing. Like it feels good. Like it feels like it works, but it's really different for sure.
That's cool. At what point do like graphics start to make their way into MUDs, and like when do we start to see things modernize a little bit? Is that like...
Yeah. So the first Okay. Well, I will say the first thing that might be called a graphical online world was probably a game called Moria on the Plato system in the mid 70s, but it was kind of an outlier. And because Plato was this very specific system that rose up in university environments, and it was had a very advanced display. It had a touch screen
in the 70s.
in a
Wow.
plasma display.
Wow.
And so people were doing online graphics, but it was also on this specific system that was like it wasn't like compatible with other things. So it kind of became like a dead end in that sense. So you do start to see in the 80s, there's things like Island of Kesmai. That one used ASCII graphics, like just symbols and stuff. And then there's also like Habitat, which was the Lucas Arts incarnation of an online world that I think first went live in 85 for a little bit as like a beta. And it was too popular. It was not profitable. They realized there was no way they would ever make money running it. So they shut it down for a few years and then relaunched it. That had, though, 2D graphics and a depiction of the world and the depiction of the characters. But with that said, MUDs themselves, they never, as you said, MUDs are alive and well today, and they never really made a transition to the graphics in a very and it's more like the genre offshoots happen. One being MMORPGs. You could also say that corridor based kind of games, RPGs through the 90s and up to till today are kind of like based on a similar idea and concept. But MUDs themselves stayed very dedicated to the text based sort of presentation. I think it was just part of their DNA.
So when you say corridor based games, do you mean like Ultima? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
I mean, like, what was it? I have the Beholder. Is that what it? There's a lot of RPGs in the 90s, early 90s, that in the late 80s that involve some sort of first person perspective, and you're running around a dungeon and you are going to be sort of interacting with enemies, maybe pressing a button here or there, but primarily you're going through these kind of rooms, which is very much how MUDs are like based up. Like each area is a room. It's got some sort of, it's a defined space. Today we would call these zones in MMORPGs. And so this is just adding graphics to that concept. It's like now you have a first person view. Now you can see the dungeon. Now you can click on things maybe with a mouse, or you would still use text commands maybe to look at things. It depends. And then like more modern sense, I would think of things like Legend of Grimrock and Legend of Grimrock 2 and those sort of games, which still exist. I mean, that's still a genre that is niche, but I think, it's definitely alive and well. If you go on Steam and look for these kind of first person corridor dungeon crawling kind of games, there's still quite a few of them.
Yeah, I actually remember seeing one that was like kind of new, and I was like, oh, this is like 2021 was when it was made. I'm like, that's kind of cool. They're still keeping the
and that's kind of the
alive.
single player. That's kind of the single player version of that. And then the multiplayer version of it ends up being MMORPGs.
So is there then what you would consider in a modern sense the first MMORPG, like as we know it, where you have people in a group and they're doing a raid or activity where there's like roles like a tank and DPS and all that stuff? Or is that like such a slow evolution that it kind of becomes that over time? Was there like a moment, like a defining moment for MMOs, do you think?
I think in that sense, by those definitions, it would have to be EverQuest. Okay. Although I will say, and these conversations always like to say that I am Western focused. Mm-hmm. There is an entire sort of ecosystem of Eastern MMORPGs I don't have a lot of familiarity with, like the Lineage series, and they were huge. I mean, they were bigger at the time in terms of player count than the early MMORPGs for the West, but I couldn't play it. I've been like, I don't really haven't had the time to go research that element. But here in the West, it was definitely EverQuest that would be the one that is kind of, it has the modern things. It has the tank and the healer and DPS. There was also support in that game, which has kind of been lost in recent MMORPGs.
What is support? What is this? I don't know. I'm really like, I don't know anything about MMORPGs really. I just played WoW for the first time like a year ago. Like,
yeah,
like, so
well, it's like in EverQuest, there was oftentimes a need to do crowd control, or to some way like split up or control the number of like enemies that were coming at you. Because sometimes you would have big packs of enemies. The dungeons weren't always designed so that, like in a modern MMORPG, they're usually designed so you can just get chunks of enemies that your group is designed to handle, and only get those ones and only get those ones. It wasn't like that in EverQuest. So you had like characters such as the Enchanter class in particular that could like mesmerize and sleep, lull, and otherwise control enemies so that you would not have to face them all at once. And that is something that hasn't really been used very commonly anymore in MMORPGs.
Some of it exists in like World of Warcraft. There are a few I can think of, like raid encounters where like there will be a ton of ads and you'll have to like
sometimes
sleep
you
some
will.
of them. Like sometimes you'll have to do that, but I wouldn't say there's enough that you would base an entire class around it.
I remember in Cataclysm, when they came out with the heroic dungeons in Cataclysm, there must have been a desire to add that back in, because when that launched, the dungeons were very hard, and there were many pools where if you pulled the entire like amount of enemies at the same time at launch with like the gear that you could have, then like you were going to get destroyed, and you had to like mesmerize and put to sleep some of these enemies in order to get through the dungeon. And the community, I don't think, really liked that very much. It was super punishing, and they did not continue, I think, for the most part with that. You'll still see it in raids and at certain mechanics, but it's not really I think it's fair to say it's not a huge part of the game right now, and especially not in dungeons anymore.
All right, well,
maybe some mythic dungeons, but
rip support, everybody. We miss your
Yeah.
support. Rest in peace. You're never coming back.
it's support classes were really cool.
It seems like you could probably break those roles up into other classes. Like when I did crowd control stuff for one of the encounters in a raid from like 2 years ago in World of Warcraft, like the hunter has like a freezing trap. I can just throw out a freezing trap and like stop a thing. And I'm not like a support class, but I do have a thing that does that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the route that most MMORPGs have gone today.
Yeah. I have a question about back to the earlier MUDs. Would they be locked to like a specific service? Because the internet back then the internet was very different, where you would like sign up for a service like Genie you were talking about, or America Online, or CompuServe or something else like that, and they were walled off from each other. Like they didn't really have a lot of communication between them. Would games be locked to one or the other, or how does that work?
I think it's fair to say it was kind of a mix. There were definitely MUDs, and some very popular ones in particular, that were locked to a particular service. Like I mentioned, Dragon's Gate being the one that was on the Genie network, and that was one that some of the Mythic, some individuals at Mythic had worked on, and it became a very popular part of that service. And it was something that the service used to advertise itself and be like, hey, if you want to play games, come to our network, do this. America Online had Neverwinter Nights, which it had graphics, so it was like not really necessarily a MUD, but it was the same idea. Like, we have this online Neverwinter Nights game. If you want to play games, come to America Online and you can play Neverwinter Nights. But on the other hand, there were also still ways to just call in and like play a specific MUD. So it was kind of a mix. And then that really was reinforced once the World Wide Web hit in 1994, and sort of the networks that were by themselves fell away. Then it was just like total free for all, very easy to connect to any MUD you wanted to, and really had a proliferation of MUDs that were at your fingertips.
Did you ever watch the show *Halt and Catch Fire*?
Yes.
Oh yeah,
the first season.
It stays pretty consistently good, but that's one of their like selling points of the online service that they're developing in the 80s is like, oh, you can play this specific game on our service. And so that's
I think that sounds like it's probably the season after, but I do remember in the first season, I think there's definitely a part where they're like playing adventure. And you know, adventure is not it's like a single player game, but the lineage is very close there, you know, like they're these text-based sort of games where you're going around and typing in commands.
Yeah. That's a great show. For anybody who hasn't watched it.
It definitely is.
I haven't watched it, and you mentioned it before, and I'm writing it down.
It's like number one on my list of shows that didn't get the hype they deserved, I think. Like, I don't know any, but I'm surprised that I'm not surprised that you in particular have seen it, but I'm like always surprised when I come across a person who has even heard of it, because I think it was named poorly.
Yeah, it's a really cool name from a technical sense. Like, I get why they went with the name. It does, but it also doesn't really describe it to people who are like, okay, what is this show about? It doesn't not sound like a show that's about, you know, creating computers in the early era.
Here's my question then, because you mentioned EverQuest, and do you have a lot of experience with EverQuest? Did you play that?
I do have a lot of experience with EverQuest. I will just, you know, soft drop this. I'm working on a book about EverQuest right now, so I know a lot about EverQuest.
Soft drop here. Heard it here first, folks. I don't know if you heard it here first, but we're gonna pretend that. Do you think, if you were gonna look back on this time period of early MMOs, because you talk about EverQuest and you talk about Dark Age of Camelot, do you have one that you think was more influential than another, or is EverQuest? Because I mean, I feel like I've heard of EverQuest. Like, I feel like most people, when they think of a pre-WoW MMO, thinks of EverQuest
or Ultima Online
Ultima Online. Yeah.
I'd say EverQuest is definitely the most influential, and then I would put Dark Age of Camelot and Ultima Online sort of right behind that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how I'd put it. And, you know, sorry, like I know there's people out there who played Asheron's Call and Anarchy Online and Meridian 59. They're screaming right now, and, you know, nothing against those games. I love Asheron's Call a lot, and Anarchy Online too. But I think when you look at the way the influence went through the years, that's kind of the order that I would put it in.
I just remember being a kid and reading EverQuest stuff in magazines and being like,
yeah,
I wish I had a computer. And I would like get hyped for it, you know, but I didn't pay the subscription. I couldn't. I was a child. So I was just like, never happening.
I know. I'm not sure. I must have gotten my mom's credit card at some point. Because I had a subscription. So I'm not sure how I managed to get that one to fly, because it must have seemed like a very strange request. But I did have a subscription. So
I had a friend growing up whose dad was a EverQuest player, which I thought was very cool that a dad played video games. And also I got to watch them play a little bit of EverQuest while they had their subscription going. I think he gave up on it shortly after we became friends. But yeah, that's my really all my EverQuest experience.
Yeah, it was such a popular game for the time.
Should we briefly, I think it's good to like touch on each one of these. So I guess we'll start with EverQuest, but like you mentioned the tank DPS. They were the ones that like defined the roles. Right. What else did EverQuest do that we see like as an influence now?
So EverQuest, I'll first note, is 1999. So it is before Dark Age of Camelot, but a couple years after Ultima Online and several years after Meridian 59. So it was not the first by any means. But EverQuest had the roles, for one thing. It also was 3D and had very attractive 3D graphics in large, for the time, detailed zones. I mean, you look at it today and it's like, looks very sparse. But for the time, everyone was blown away because it was a game that required a 3D graphics accelerator, which was still kind of a new thing to require a 3D graphics accelerator and not have a software renderer at the time. And so that sort of visual presentation and the kind of world building that went with it, I think made a very big impression. It also had a class system, you know, and not a skill-based system. There are actually skills in it technically, but like they're not nearly as important as your class. It was structured in levels 1 to 50, which did not necessarily have to be the case. That is not how Ultima Online was. And so all of these things had set the kind of blueprint for MMORPGs that I think World of Warcraft later came along, because a lot of people who made World of Warcraft were big EverQuest fans and said, okay, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do our own spin on it. And we're going to, just make it a little bit more accessible. But if EverQuest didn't exist, you kind of have to wonder, like, would World of Warcraft or a Blizzard MMORPG, like, what would it look like? Would it have levels? It might not. Levels were not guaranteed. Today we're so used to seeing levels that it's like, of course games have levels in MMORPGs, but it could have been a skill-based system. It could have been something else that became most common.
So how did you play Ultima Online as well?
Yeah.
So how did that system work versus EverQuest system? I don't know anything about Ultima Online, honestly.
It's like your character has a bunch of skills. It's like imagine Skyrim without a level that's attached to what your skills are doing. If you just take the level off of your, that kind of game, then you basically have kind of an Ultima Online system. You have a bunch of skills and you can level them up independently. I believe RuneScape, old school RuneScape also works this way.
I played RuneScape.
I played a lot of that.
I did play RuneScape. So.
When RuneScape was brand new, I played a lot of that. I really liked how you didn't have to pick a class.
Yeah, so it's like you just kind of do whatever, in those games, and your skills level up, and then that's your character. If you happen to decide you like to hit things with the sword a lot, you become a fighter. If you happen to decide you like to make armor, you become an armorer, or eventually you can do all these things on one character if you want. But EverQuest was a lot different. It had classes and levels, and your levels very precisely decided what your power was, and the class very precisely decided what your capabilities were, both in the sense of what you could do, and also probably even more importantly, what you cannot do, which you cannot have one character that does everything, not even close. And so those are the ways that the skill-based and the level-based systems differ. It's a pretty substantial difference.
Then let's move on then to Dark Age of Camelot. I figure we can kind of go through each one here because graphically, Dark Age of Camelot does some pretty incredible things, right? And also like world size. I know you said it's bigger. It's much bigger at this for anything else at the time.
Yeah, Dark Age of Camelot was like taking the sort of ideas and presentation of EverQuest and then just kind of turning it up another notch so that you had much larger zones and zones that had a lot more detail in them. And it was particularly focused on outdoor zones. It was a game that had a lot of big outdoor areas, scenic vistas and stuff like that, which was something that original EverQuest tried to do, but I'd say like there was a pretty big difference in the visual presentation of the two games, and Dark Age of Camelot really nailed that a lot better. So when it came out in 2001, a couple years later, it really caught the eye of a lot of folks, not just MMORPG players, but also role-playing game players that were maybe looking at MMORPGs and looking for something that felt more like the 2001 presentation. That was definitely something that got a lot of players to go over and take a look at Dark Age of Camelot.
And that remember listening to you, watching your video, you mentioned they chose Camelot because that's like an open IP.
Yes, because it's open. Because the thing was that they were going to make the game. So Mythic had this MUD series called Darkness Falls, and they were going to make the game based off of that. But apparently, Mark Jacobs decided he didn't think that was going to be popular enough. So he was like, okay, like what can we use instead? We don't want to license something. What can we use instead? And they decided on Dark Age of Camelot because the Arthurian tales and all this mythic, all these myths and stuff, because it's Dark Age of Camelot includes the Arthurian tales, but also Celtic and Norse mythologies in it, forming the three different sides. And all this stuff, it's completely public domain. Like, no, you don't have to license it to talk about this kind of stuff. So they just took that and built from there. to create a setting that was like recognizable, but at the same time, didn't necessarily call out to like any specific pre-existing and anything that anyone owned any IP for.
Gotcha. So you just mentioned something that I want to go back on. You said 3 sides. Were there factions in these earlier games? Kind of like you got the
Yes.
Horde and Alliance in WoW. So there
Yeah.
were factions?
Yeah. And so there were factions so the earlier games, Darkness Falls by Mythic, had factions. It had like a good, evil, and chaos. I believe that was the breakdown. And the idea was that you had a 3-sided faction PvP thing where you had like actual sides and it wasn't a free-for-all, and you had sort of goals and objectives to take out players from the other faction and to fight over objectives the other faction might have possession of in order to get bonuses. And they pretty much directly took that idea and made it the realm versus realm combat of Dark Age of Camelot, because that was their game and they did in fact have ownership of those ideas. So they just took that and directly put it over to Dark Age Camelot. The other games in the MMORPG genre generally did not have factions. You can kind of make an argument that Everquest has a good and evil faction loosely because there's like all these different reputations. And if you play an evil character, you start out with bad reputation with the good ones. And if you play a good character, you start with bad reputation with the evil ones. So the guards will kill you. But that's not really the same thing. And then like Ultima Online, no, that was complete free for all, as players who played it will tell you. Just complete chaos, especially at launch. Kind of the same thing with Meridian 59. So the faction thing was still pretty novel.
What's Meridian 59's premise? You've mentioned that a couple of times now. Was that like a fantasy MMO or was that a little different?
It was a fantasy MMO, yeah. I'm not super familiar with the details of the Meridian 59 lore. It was a fantasy MMO, and it took a fairly free-for-all, free-form kind of gameplay. It was pseudo 3D. It was like one of those games where you have like a 3D environment with 2D sprites, that are moving around. So, kind of like your Doom sort of thing, but in an MMORPG that was fantasy based. And it came out in like 1995. So it was a predecessor before Ultima Online, and was really one of the, you can look at Meridian 59 and say like, that is sort of the earliest predecessor of what we think of as the kind of MMORPGs we play today. But it didn't have a lot of the systems we're familiar with. And it also just wasn't that popular of a game compared to some of the ones that came later. So that, I think, kind of had an influence on how widely that game, reached.
Gotcha. And in that same vein, then, is there, at the time, are there in like the 90s, I guess, like this is like mid to late 90s, early 2000s, were there sci-fi MMORPGs? Are we seeing like other stuff coming up, or is it really just kind of fantasy only?
So not really much on the sci-fi side. I know that so Anarchy Online, Funcom's MMORPG, I believe that is 2001, might be 2000. So I'm not 100% on that, but that era, and I really liked that game. I played that a lot when it came out. That was the first big sci-fi MMORPG, I would say. Now, I don't want to say there was none, because I'm sure someone will be like, "Oh, there was this," and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that one, or I hadn't heard of that one." But for the most part, it was all fantasy, and that kind of continues to this day. Honestly, like fantasy's kind of been the predominant genre. I would like to see more sci-fi games in this genre, but I guess, I don't know. I guess just I think that there's the Anarchy Online had kind of a rough time after launch. And then there was that Tabula Rasa game that was like, that was made. Oh, it would have been like a 2007, 2008 era kind of thing that totally flopped. And then you had Wildstar. And I think like these successive, like sort of like games that either didn't succeed that big or failed have just like had a reoccurring effect on MMORPGs and just dissuading people from making sci-fi themed ones.
Yeah, I guess about the only one I can think of that like that I would consider successful is maybe like the Old Republic. Although you could make a strong argument that Star Wars is not sci-fi and is in fact fantasy. So
yeah, I there is the Star Wars, the Old Republic, and Star Wars Galaxies before that. But I mean, it's like it's Star Wars. I feel like that's kind of cheating.
Yeah.
So then let's talk about the next one I can think of that we're kind of in this time period, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is Asheron's Call. So what's like the premise of that game, and what did that bring to the table? Did that bring anything new, or was it just kind of like another story?
Asheron's Call is like, I really love Asheron's Call. That was probably my favorite of the era. I played more of that at the time than EverQuest. And Asheron's Call had a few interesting things going for it. The first was that I know I said Dark Age of Camelot was big, but Asheron's Call was actually bigger and before Dark Age of Camelot. And the thing about Asheron's Call was that the entire overworld, open world area was seamless. So there was no zones, and you could actually go to like the mountaintop and you could look out and you could see everything around you. Now, everything around you didn't necessarily look great. And I think that was something that kind of dissuaded some players, but you could go and do that. And it was a very big technical achievement. There were still zones to go into dungeons, but all the open world outside areas were all together. And Asheron's Call also, it was a combination of a skill and level based system. So there was a pretty big effect of the skills you chose. There was not classes. So you made your character from skills you chose, and then you had a level that was applied on that, but not a class. So you had a lot of interesting builds. You'd have a lot of like battle mages and characters that like do a little healing and do a little offensive casting and all kinds of different things. And that made it pretty interesting and fun to make your own build. Also because the level cap was like absurdly high. So you had a lot of room to run with. And then the third thing about Asheron's Call, and maybe the biggest influence, was that they started doing like these monthly update kind of things really early on and applying the idea of having consistent updates that were part of a story really early on in the game's lifespan. And that was an idea that it took a while for other MMORPGs to start to get on board with. But I think today you can see that is something that eventually nearly all MMORPGs have decided is important, to have some kind of regular update system that is not just, oh, you get this boxed expansion every 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. And Asheron's Call, I think, really paved the way for that, and making that a structured thing with actual goals and points and story beats, in a way that showed all other MMORPGs kind of what you need to do there.
That would have been pretty novel for any kind of game around that time, right? Because at the time in this like pre games as a service sort of thing, like you bought the game, what was in the box was what you got, and maybe if there were bugs, you could find a patch online to download to like fix the bugs, right? But like otherwise, you bought an expansion to move on. So like nowadays, games are all like, if there's no post game support, it feels like the game is dead, even though like games used to just come out and then not get updates, and it was fine.
Yeah. Another comparison that I think of is like, in the last few years, Fortnite has gained a lot of notoriety for these in-game sort of events. And it's like, oh, the sky shatters and, this crazy thing happens while the players are in the game. Asheron's Call was basically doing the same thing. They had these big events where like the sky would cloud. There was this demon that would show up and start saying crazy stuff, and everybody be freaking out like, what's going on? Why is this demon here? What are we supposed to do? And that really motivated the player base and kept them engaged with the story of the game in a way that wasn't really the case with like EverQuest and other games. Dark Age of Camelot, they kind of put out their patches on more of a I think it's fair to say it was more of like a technical thing. It's like, oh, we're gonna fix these bugs, we're gonna introduce maybe this little enhancement here, but it wasn't really so structured.
Yeah,
So-
maybe you would get some maps for like a first-person shooter or something later. Like maybe.
Yeah.
So Asheron's Call felt more like an actual living world, like we see today, where things just like pop up and you're
Yeah,
like, oh,
which
this
is
great.
Yeah, I think it's the main thing that people who played Asheron's Call really loved it for. Unfortunately, Asheron's Call is no longer available as a official, legitimately run game, but there are quite a few emulated servers of it, which are fairly well populated. So
That's what, okay, that was actually something I was going to ask you later on this episode, but we can talk about it right now, I guess. Can you play like Dark Age of Camelot now? Is it
yes,
around? You can?
there is an official way to play it. It's interesting. So Broadsword Online Entertainment runs it. They also run Ultima Online. And this is a company that's run by Rob Denton, which is one of the two original co-founders of Mythic. And so it's like same. So this guy, Rob Denton, he's like still running the game. Broadsword is kind of hard to get a hold of though, and so is Rob Denton. So they kind of, and the community has kind of complained about this. It's not easy to really see like what the direction is of the game. It's not like say EverQuest is right now. EverQuest has a very like it has a pretty big team dedicated to it, and it's coming out with regular updates, expansions, and whatnot. That's not really the case with Dark Age of Camelot right now on the official version. There's also unofficial emulated server things happening, and these seem to pop up in the community every so often. It seems like there's kind of a rolling thing where like a new one will pop up and it will get really popular because everyone wants to go and play it and to be with other players, because that's where the fun is, particularly in a game that has realm versus realm combat. Eventually that kind of like dies down, and then maybe after like another 2 years another server will pop up, and these are all unofficial and kind of not above board, but at the same time Broadsword doesn't seem like they're going after them. So those are things that are regularly available, and these are get posted on Reddit all the time. You just go to the Dark Age Camelot Reddit, you'll run into this kind of stuff.
I love that private servers exist for a lot of old games like that, because games that require an infrastructure cost money to run and therefore will be shut down when they are not profitable.
Yeah,
and it feels like we lose these games, some of the less popular ones that don't have private servers pop up or community run servers. So it just makes me happy that you can still play these games.
Yeah, me too. There are, it's good to see these ones have been preserved, and there are definitely ones that have not been. So it's shame when those are lost, and I hope that the community can keep these sort of things going, or with Broadsword Entertainment, if they can keep Dark Age Camelot going, that's awesome to see.
So you just said something. This is great because I'm thinking you're saying things and I get like, oh, I have a new question. Okay. PvP.
Yes.
How did that start with MMOs, and was it important in early MMOs, or did they not include it? And it kind of just, because you just mentioned Realm stuff in Dark Age of Camelot, right? Did EverQuest have PvP, Ultima Online? How did that kind of stuff work?
It depended on the game. I'd say PvP / whether you have PvP or not is something that came directly out of MUDs. You can imagine when the first ones were getting made, no one really knew whether or not players should be able to attack each other or not. So some of them you could, and some of them you couldn't. And it, as just like today, it was a very big point of contention for the community. Some people like to play games where you could have PvP and you could just go on and stomp anyone, and it was total free for all, no restrictions. And then other people wanted to have tightly controlled, curated, mostly against the monsters, the mobs in the environment, and they wanted to play that way. And it's a big debate, like which way is the better way to play, like the Care Bear sort of thing is coming in from that era. And MMORPGs took different approaches to it. Ultima Online was a free-for-all. EverQuest had PvP servers, but it was kind of an afterthought, and the developers were very strongly committed to PvE content. And Dark Age Camelot had realm versus realm, but it was a very structured sort of player versus player combat where you weren't rolling a character and just getting ganked the moment that you came into the world. You like leveled up with your other people in your faction for a bit, and then you could start to get into realm versus realm experiences out in the frontiers, I believe they were called. And so these were all different ways of going about it. Anarchy Online had another way too. They had this thing called, what was it called? It was like suppression gas. And the idea was that as you got further away from cities, the suppression gas that was put out by the into the governments in the cities was like getting less and less effective. So you kind of transitioned from partial to from non PvP to full PvP areas. I thought
like the wilderness in RuneScape, like the further
I was
you
going to say that. I love the wilderness. Oh,
yeah, it's that same sort of like gradual, some PvP areas, some not PvP areas kind of thing.
That was like one of those things as a kid that you felt so bad when you're like, I'm gonna go step over the line into the wilderness, and then you step back, and then there's always some like level 100 like decked out guy there waiting to murder you when you cross the line. So that's interesting then. So in a sense, they were all just experimenting with it, and they're because I feel like now in most MMOs you can just turn it on or off, or it's a server based kind of thing, right? Because like I'm thinking about New World here specifically, where you could just go to a town and turn on the button or turn it off.
Right.
Yeah, WoW's like that too now.
Yeah, it's like, and they were still griefing. I mean, it's still it's funny to think about. That's that far back. And now, I mean, as a person who plays Dungeons and Dragons, there's like I have friends that are like, can we fight each other? And I'm like, no, because it will tear the group apart, and we already have trouble meeting already. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to just do that at all. But then, okay, so because we kind of mentioned it a couple of times, I think we should give it its due say, because it's the one that I have experience with and Tyler does, RuneScape. When does that, do you know a lot about RuneScape? Did that come in like a little later? I'm trying to think in my head, like timing wise, when RuneScape came out. And I was in middle school, so this is probably like early 2000s.
I would admit 2001, 2002 is like old school RuneScape.
It is? Okay.
Yeah. I'm not super familiar with RuneScape, actually. That is one that I am actually starting to become more familiar with. I started playing old school RuneScape recently because I realized I had not played it. And I was like, I really want to play this game that I missed when I was younger. I did have friends in college who were super into it, but like I never got into it myself. I have a book here that I haven't yet to read. RuneScape, the first 20 years. Have either of you picked up this book?
No, I really want to read it now, because I was there like very much like very close to the beginning of that game. Like I guess I said old school RuneScape. Yeah. What I meant was RuneScape Classic, which ran for a little while. Maybe there's private servers for it now. But like what players have nostalgia for now of this like old school RuneScape is like years after I stopped playing the game. So I always have like it's weird for me when people talk about old school RuneScape. Yeah, and it's newer than what I ever played.
Yeah, that was my first experience because you could play it in a browser. So it was like very accessible to me in middle school. You could play it on any computer. And I still remember it crashing constantly all the time because I never had it figued out. But
yeah, that's why it was popular in college too, because we were all like, well, we have bad computers because we can't afford anything. And I actually did not play MMORPGs for a few years there because I couldn't run anything on my computer. This was like around 2004, 2005. But yeah, I do remember RuneScape being very popular, and I won't try to go into it since I'm not super familiar with RuneScape at this point, but there is a book, RuneScape, the first 20 years, an illustrated history. It's an official book by Jagex, and I believe it's still pretty widely available. And it's got lots of excellent illustrations and concept art from the early days of the game up to the modern era. So if anyone is wanting more RuneScape history, I would recommend taking a look at it.
I'm going to check that out for sure.
We might now cover it on the podcast. We were looking for a new book, and this sounds like something that Tyler and I both know. So this is like
for sure,
exciting.
For sure.
Well, then I guess we should just talk about the juggernaut in the room we haven't really discussed yet, and that is WoW.
I was gonna say my questions around WoW mainly are like, so what was it about WoW that was so whatever it was, right? In 2004, 2005, and then like, but were there any building blocks along the way? Like, were there things that Asheron's Call had that Dark Age of Camelot had, the Anarchy Online had, those games that like sort of you could see the pathway into WoW, or was WoW just like so out of left field that you just couldn't see it coming?
World of Warcraft was definitely, I definitely wouldn't call it out of left field. It was really like not a very revolutionary game in a lot of aspects. In typical Blizzard fashion, it was more a refinement of things that came before it. I really see like, so Dark Age of Camelot, it's interesting because it kind of wedged itself in between EverQuest and World of Warcraft as kind of a link there, in the sense that when you get to Dark Age of Camelot, and that game comes out in 2001, there's a number of things about it that are just more approachable for players. The enemies, they're not quite so tough. Like, they're still pretty tough, but like they're not like in EverQuest where basically you really can't really solo in many cases an enemy that's the same level as you, because you might beat them, but if you die, you lose experience. So it's just really not worth it. You know, like either you need a good group or you need the solo things lower level. Dark Age of Camelot makes it easier to see just what level enemies are. They have little colored name tags over their head. Dark Age of Camelot gives you horses that can fast travel between locations. You know, that's something very familiar in World of Warcraft. And that was something that was not found in EverQuest and generally not really found in MMORPGs before. So they had the faction system. Again, you know, as far as wrapping that into PvP, that was something that was not really a thing before Dark Age of Camelot. And then I think World of Warcraft kind of spun off of that with the idea of like battlegrounds, kind of a more controlled faction system area, rather than having it just be open, kind of an open world area like Dark Age of Camelot did. But World of Warcraft in particular was definitely very heavily influenced by EverQuest. And I think that Dark Age of Camelot was this kind of a filter that was applied over that and got them to think a little bit differently about some ideas, so that you end up with something that kind of has some elements of both, but more strongly on the EverQuest side than on the Dark Age of Camelot side.
You actually just mentioned something that I wanted to ask about all these games, is how did they handle death differently, like player death?
Oh yeah, that's a big one. So EverQuest was, you got an experience penalty and you lost all of your stuff. So that was a big deal.
All of it? Just everything?
Everything you were carrying.
Yikes.
Wow.
So there were banks, so you could have some stuff in reserve in the bank, but everything you were carrying on you was on your corpse, and you had to go get it. Which obviously would probably be difficult because the thing that killed you was probably there or in the area. So it was hard. Like, that was pretty hard.
Could other players grab your stuff for you? Or did you have to go get your stuff?
Actually, let's see how that worked. So no, there was like corpse. How did it work? I think there was corpse dragging was how it worked at launch. You could give someone permission to like drag your corpse. So you could help out people in that way. There also were like ways to like locate your corpse instead. If you like were like, oh my God, if you got killed when you were lost, like that was like the worst thing in EverQuest. If you got lost in a zone and then you died, so you didn't even know where your corpse was. So there's various ways players could help out each other in EverQuest and to get your corpse back. And that was really important because if you're on your own, it was very, very difficult. Dark Age of Camelot, when it came out, I don't believe there was any XP penalty or corpse mechanic. I don't want to speak to super definitively because the mechanics have changed over time, I believe, but I believe that was the way it was at launch. It's the way I recall it being at launch, and my memory can be faulty in that regard. And then World of Warcraft, of course, had the no corpse retrieval, really, aside from you being a ghost and you had to get in like the general area. And you as a ghost, you even walked faster. So it was like way, way easier to go and to get your body than it had been back with EverQuest.
So is it fair to say that EverQuest is much harder, it sounds like, than these later, like you said, the difficulty spike is like EverQuest was pretty hard. Dark Age of Camelot makes things a little bit more welcoming. And then, WoW, maybe that attributes to its success, is it's a lot nicer to the player, it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because like people's perspectives on this are different, because today you will hear, of course, World of Warcraft players, or they think Classic and are like, whoa, Classic was so hard. We need to go back to Classic because it was so hardcore. But of course, an EverQuest player would be like, ha, 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 you kids in your ghost corpse runs and not losing all your stuff. And then your Ultima Online players would be like, ha, 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 you kids being able to step outside of town and not get immediately ganked and lose everything and then respawn and do it over and over again 10 times so you quit the game. Like, it's funny how that like goes back, but I think, yeah, EverQuest was a much harder game. Not all of that difficulty was necessarily good gameplay. I will say I'm playing EverQuest right now on P99. I'm enjoying it, but like I can recognize that there are elements of that game that are just like not really enjoyable by a modern standard for sure.
So my other question, kind of going down the list of things in MMOs I think about, how did these games economies function? Were there
Oh, that's a
economies?
good one.
Like, did they have trading posts like we see in like modern MMOs?
So it again varied quite a bit by the game, and this was something that was a big point of contention and difference between something like EverQuest and something like Ultima Online. Dark Age of Camelot, I think, would be much more on the EverQuest side. So with EverQuest, Dark Age of Camelot, you were generally looking at more of a crafting system like you might think of World of Warcraft today, where you've got like items that you can make with kind of like set recipes. And you can skill up, to make better stuff. And in general, these items are things that are not going to be, they are useful, but they're not necessarily the best things all the time, depending on how the balance is for a particular patch or a particular expansion cycle. Dark Age of Camelot had the sort of wrinkle of the realm versus realm combat, and there were certain items or things that you might need in the realm versus realm combat that would be particularly useful. But in general, the crafting system in the economy system was not really the main focus. Now, Ultima Online was sort of a different beast. A game like that, you would have all kinds of things that players could make, and oftentimes the best things were player made. And there was a lot of players gathering resources and making things out of those resources, and the economy was a really big engine and a drive of that game. It was as much about gaining wealth and becoming sort of this economic engine onto yourself as it was about going out and adventuring. And I think it's probably fair to say that the EverQuest, Dark Age Camelot to World of Warcraft sort of lineage has won out for the most part, but obviously there's still a lot of games out there that do go for the more player crafted kind of thing as well.
Interesting. So then I guess, I have more, Tyler. Feel free to cut me off, Tyler, if you have something to break in, but I want to know the idea of the raid in an MMO.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question.
Is that something that develops at this time, or is it is? Okay.
Although Dark Age Camelot did not really have much for raids. It wasn't as much a focus in that game because the realm versus realm combat became kind of, they did have that sort of content, but I think the general consensus was it wasn't that great. Whereas the realm versus realm combat kind of became the main thing in Dark Age of Camelot. That was the main way people were spending their time. Now, in EverQuest, there were definitely raids.
When we talk about raids too, should we define what we
when
we say raid for folks who maybe haven't played?
That's a good point, because okay, so let's say define raids. Let's just think World of Warcraft. Instance, 25, 40, 10, whatever, some sort of set amount of people. And that's not the way it worked when raids first started to come about in EverQuest. Raids, when they first started to come about in EverQuest, were like a real madhouse, because basically all they really had was this idea that there's like really tough enemies in the world, and players started to form up to defeat them. And so early raids in EverQuest had they were not instance either. They're in the same shared world. So you had, groups of 80 or 90 people going in to destroy a monster, and they wouldn't even always be from the same guild. They wouldn't always be necessarily even on the same side. So you would have different groups competing to try and get the kill credit. in the raid because it was not instanced. So you might have some players from the evil sort of factions going in and some players from the good factions going in, and they couldn't kill each other if they weren't on a PvP server in EverQuest. Most of it was PvE content, but they were still fighting over trying to do the most damage and kill the monster. And so that was one of the main things I think with World of Warcraft, that how they really redefined the raid experience and put more structure on it and made it something that was like a much more gamified, structured, refined sort of experience compared to what had existed prior in EverQuest.
Wow. It's so, yeah, it's just so interesting to see the,
like, you can imagine 90 people,
90 people.
Yeah. Wow.
Just like battling it out, frame rate in the single digits,
explosions everywhere. No one knows what's going on. Pure chaos.
Yeah.
It almost seems like it would have been a much bigger deal too. Obviously there's so many more people, but like, because it's not instanced, you're sort of sharing this world with anybody else who wants to go and try to take on this monster also. So it feels like the stakes are a little bit higher, whereas like in WoW, if you fail on a raid and everybody bails, like, okay, fine, you lost time. But it feels like you could lose opportunities in some of these older games if you weren't the one that killed the monster and it doesn't respawn for another day, right?
Oh yeah, and I think sometimes a day would even be optimistic on some of those spawn timers for some of those EverQuest monsters. So it was a very tense experience. I can see why it didn't, persevere throughout the years, because first of all, getting 80 or 90 people coordinated, like, you could imagine how much of a difficult task that would
probably
be.
No voice chat back in the day.
Yeah, I think for the most part they weren't doing it through voice chat. I think if anything, you would have like maybe a raid leader that was on some kind of comm that people could listen to.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't really have much of a capability to have everyone talk and communicate other than through chat. And then also you've got the spawn timers and you've got all the different weird buffs and items that people could get. So, raiding was very much the sort of old school thing, the poop socking, as a term I don't hear referred to as much these days. But back of that, it was like, yeah, a raid could be a 12-hour thing. And if you failed and you didn't get the kill, that was a big deal, because not only because you spent all that time, but like someone else could come along and do it. And then maybe you can't get that kill for days or another week or something before you can give it another try. And that's a big deal.
Yeah, it sounds like the most punishing way to keep players engaged is to make them come back 4 days later.
Right. And, like the only people that really got to do those sort of raids in EverQuest were elite guilds who were playing the game all the time, which is kind of the problem. Some people who made World of Warcraft, like Rob Pardo and Jeff Kaplan, were in those guilds. But a lot of people that were more casual players, well, they probably just didn't do the raids. That's what I did. I didn't do the raids when EverQuest was originally out. So, but there were other things to do in the game. So that did work out okay.
So my other question about these early MMOs, was there like socially, was there a guild you could join, or was there like groups in that way? Has that always been kind of a part of these games, was like guilds and teaming up with people like-minded players here? Or
I think it's always been a part of, even from MUDs, like you would generally see guilds. I'm sure in the very first MUDs there was not an official guild system, but a lot of games got official guild systems, and that would translate over the MMORPGs. You'd have official guild systems. A lot of times they were very basic. It's just you'd have a tag by your name. I think one of the most interesting ones was the patron system in Asheron's Call. They had this very elaborate system where people swore fealty to like their patron, and there was some kind of cap on it. So you couldn't have everyone swear to the same person. So it was like you'd have this top person, there'd be like 10 people below them, and then each of them would have like 10 people sworn to them, and they could have people sworn to them. And there was also an experience sharing element of this where people shared the person that you swore fealty to got some experience for you earning experience. So
it's
the
just
idea
multi-level
was,
marketing.
No, it was like the idea was supposed to be that like you would swear field to this person that was higher level than you, and they would get some bonuses, and then they would teach you how to play the game and give you stuff so you did well because they got some of your experience. And it did kind of work, but also, it wasn't really a guild system as we know it today.
It was a pyramid scheme, as Tyler.
Pyramid scheme. Monsters could also level up in that game, which was a funny thing.
Like
Monsters?
if they killed you, they would
yes, an Asheron's Call, which mostly didn't have much of an effect, but every now and then you'd like get some unusually tough monster because they killed some players and leveled up, and that would always be kind of funny.
That's kind of cool though. I like that the world is leveling up around you too. That's kind of neat. Tyler, did you have anything else to add here? Do you have any questions or anything like that? Or
before we talk more like modern MMOs, I do want to talk a little bit about like World of Warcraft and stuff. But did you ever play Final Fantasy 11? Because that's the only other MMO that I have any more, more than a dozen hours in.
I did not play Final Fantasy 11. So not at all. And I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy 14, but I think Final Fantasy 11 came out in that period when I wasn't playing a lot of MMOs due to my lackluster hardware capabilities. So I ended up, I did not latch onto that one.
It was cool. It was more like EverQuest than it was like WoW, at least when it first came out.
That's what I've taken from descriptions of it. Yes.
Yeah. You lose experience, man. Seeing the words level down when you die feels real bad. It plays like a really like messed up version of the Final Fantasy like victory fanfare when you level down. It feels very bad.
Honestly, I should try it because like I said, I'm playing EverQuest P99 right now. And I am enjoying it. So maybe I should try playing Final Fantasy 11 because I know it's still live and has a fairly active fan base.
Yeah. I think there are some there might be some private servers too. I'm not sure about that, but I wish what they would do is include a Final Fantasy 11 subscription with Final Fantasy 14 because I would play.
Well, that would be nice.
I would fire it up, but I'm not going to pay a separate subscription for it.
That would actually be a really good idea, like WoW does with like Blizzard does with World of Warcraft and Classic.
Exactly. Yeah.
In RuneScape, they also give you both. It seems like the sensible thing to do.
Yeah, it seems. I don't know how many people are double dipping here, right? Up between like,
it can't be that many,
14.
right?
Yeah,
I feel like you'd get more subscriptions than you would could ever possibly lose. But
yeah, you'd get some people who would go back and play the old thing. You would also probably help some people transition to the new thing if they're still on the old thing. I don't know. It seems like seems like a good idea to me, but I'm not a business person, so.
Then should we move on to World of Warcraft and talk about that to kind of close out?
Yeah, I want to hear more about what World of Warcraft did. Like, so you said there was a lot of stuff that it did that existed before. Like this is a classic Blizzard thing of like taking stuff and then refining it. What were those refinements? Like, what was the magic that like made it all work? Or if you agree, maybe you don't even agree that there was some magic there. I think clearly there was, at least in terms of like player count and things like that. Like objectively, you can say something happened there. What was it?
Well, I think one big thing was that it had a quest system that was more than just bare bones, and that really existed as a role-playing game quest system that we know in a modern context. With a lot of the early MMORPGs, you had quests, but they were handled in this very vague way where you would either get like text descriptions about what was being asked of you, and that was kind of it, and you had to like kind of write them. You just had to write it down. You got some sort of text and you had to write it down and just try and figure out what you had to do based on that. And in World of Warcraft, that was still sometimes the case, but you didn't even have things like the exclamation point over someone's head or a nice little box telling you what was going on. In EverQuest, if you wanted a quest, the first thing you had to do was you had to go up to an NPC and like go hail, like /hail, and that would get them to talk to you. And there was no way to know who was going to give you a quest or not. So you just had to kind of go around and hail all these people, or probably more likely know from the online forums who gave quests, and go talk to them. And they would say something to you. And usually there'd be some kind of chain where it'd be like, okay, I need 5 bear butts. And it'd say like bear butts in brackets or something like that. And then you had to chat back to them. You had to type in okay, what kind of bears? Or you'd have to like say that phrase, bare butts. You'd have to say bare butts for the text parser, the pickup that you were doing this quest. And then you have to go out and do it. And there was no maps. EverQuest didn't have a map system at launch at all. And this was true of most MMORPGs. So it was kind of just, you go out, you try and figure it out, you bring it back, you give it to the person, and maybe you would be lucky to find another quest. But for the most part, you were going out and you were grinding monsters with other players. And that was the bulk of the gameplay. That's pretty much what you were doing from 1 to level cap or 1 to skill cap. And World of Warcraft, it came in and introduced the idea that you have quests and zones, and you kind of chain from one area to another, and you kind of go through this somewhat guided experience that would get you through the progression. There were some lulls in that, where in World of Warcraft you did have to grind at launch to get through your leveling progression, but it was overall a lot more connected. And it was the same way with the dungeons. You were much better guided towards where your dungeons are and what those were going to be, whereas in EverQuest and Asheron's Call, dungeons were just these open world areas that were, everyone was in the same one, and there was kind of a free-for-all. And so sometimes it would be great if you had a good group and you had a relatively sparsely populated dungeon. And other times you just could go in and you'd just be like, okay, well, there's 20 other people here and the monsters aren't spawning quickly enough. So we're going to kill a monster about once every 30 minutes. And I'm not really going to get any experience today. And that was just how it went with a lot of those earlier MMORPGs. So there was a lot of those convenience, ease of approach, just not like wasting the player's time kind of things that World of Warcraft did to speed things along and to open up the genre to a wider variety of people interested in role-playing games.
I miss that time because like I was in high school when this was going on, right? And I remember not hanging out with friends because they had raid nights and I didn't know what was going on. And I always felt like I was like on the side of it and I was too afraid to ask. But I remember it being like everyone was playing WoW. That was like the big moment. This is like, I want to say like 2005. Does that sound about right? 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
Like that was the big deal.
And that's another element of like, again, of structure and evolution that you think about with World of Warcraft. When it came out, like it had, you had raids and dungeons, and there was an idea of items that you could get that were sort of supposed to be relatively balanced with the items other classes could get. It's not how it worked out in practice, but the idea was there. And that was not something they necessarily saw in the earlier games. The way that the itemization was done and the progression was done was just like a lot more scattershot. There was less overall structure, and it was more like individuals thinking like, okay, this would be cool to add to the game. This would be cool to add to the game. And to be fair, like there was still a lot of that in World of Warcraft. Like the World of Warcraft development was a mess. But ultimately, once it did wrap up and it shipped, they did put out something that felt more refined and more complete than what had come before.
What other more modern MMOs from around, I guess maybe from around that time, because there's like WoW of back then, from almost 20 years ago, and then there's WoW now, and they're similar but different. Are there other games from around the time of WoW that you think contributed to sort of the zeitgeist of MMOs?
I would say probably not.
It was just that was it. WoW came out and it was like everything else was.
That was the weird thing about World of Warcraft, and the blessing and the curse of World of Warcraft. It was so popular, so much so than anything else that had come out, and really than most things that have come since, that it completely flipped the script on expectations of what a successful MMORPG should be. And as a consequence of that, there is this graveyard of games that come out after it that you look at it, those games, and if you think about it, like, so a great one is Mythic's great example of this is Mythic's follow-up after Dark Age of Camelot, Warhammer Online. Do you remember Warhammer Online?
I've heard of Warhammer Online.
Yeah.
I watched a couple of videos on Warhammer Online because I had no idea it existed until like a year ago.
So this is a game that came out. What was it? I think it was 2008, 2007 or 2008. And so Warhammer Online was going to be Mythic's big follow-up. They had been acquired. They ended up getting acquired by EA. They had the Warhammer license. And it was really like a very similar evolution of Dark Age Camelot. There's still a big focus on PvP and realm versus realm. And they were just evolving that with a more modern engine and this Warhammer class system. And it was a pretty interesting game. And it was successful in the sense that it sold like 1 million copies at launch. And it's like, oh, we got 800,000 subscribers. And EA is like, excuse me, 800,000? WoW's got like 10 million. What are you guys doing? You're all fired. And that's pretty much how it went. That's pretty much how it went for a lot of games. I mean, you look at games like Age of Conan and I don't know, Rift, and even Star Wars: The Old Republic, which was a few years later. Now Warhammer got creamed and they went offline pretty quickly. A lot of the other games I just mentioned are still available today, but a lot of these games that came out in the 5-10 years after World of Warcraft, I think just kind of got sucked into this vortex of expectations that any game that comes out needs to be as successful as World of Warcraft. Also, in order to be as successful as World of Warcraft, it has to look like World of Warcraft. And it was really hard to get away from that. Lord of the Rings Online is another good one, which, again, I really like Lord of the Rings Online. I think it's a great game. And if you look at the numbers in a vacuum when it was launched, you might say, oh, that seems pretty good. But compared to World of Warcraft, it was like, not good. So even though the game was like a really good MMORPG, it never got the attention that it probably should have. And as a result, a lot of anything that might have been like unique ideas in those games kind of just got washed away for a while. I mean, really till today.
Is there when did Dungeons and Dragons Online come out?
Was it around that like 2008 era? I want to say.
Did it get stuck in that rift too then of WoW, you think?
Yes.
As far as getting the vortex of it? Because I remember we talk about this a lot. Like Tyler and I have talked about like gaming fads, like we are out of the battle royale fad now, but that was definitely a thing like 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about 2007, 2008 is it was this MMO fad where everything, there was a Star Trek one too, wasn't there?
Star Trek Online still exists.
Still running.
Still exists. Yeah. And it was just like, these are all these games that just didn't live up to the hype because everyone thought it was like a money machine. And then it just fell apart because they couldn't match it, I guess.
I'm sure some of those games were good too.
Yeah.
It's just hard when you're like what you're saying is when your benchmark is now 10 million subscribers in WoW. Like nobody has gotten that or will, since then even, right? Like except for World of Warcraft, pretty much.
Yeah.
Which is like you can be successful without 10 million subscribers, but it's hard in the comparison, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It was just the expectations got so high, and then because the expectations were so high, the amount of money that was getting put into developing these games and the scope and the scale they had to launch at became so large, which is something that MMORPGs struggle with to this day, especially ones that are big AAA MMORPGs. You've got to launch with such so much content, it seems like, in order to not be declared a dead game. I think like New World ran into this big time. Mm-hmm. Like they had a huge launch, and then after a few, like basically a month or two, players had gone through everything that was available on the high end, and they're like, where's the rest of the game? Where's the rest of the game? Why is this not have, all these different kinds of encounters and all these different kinds of PvP systems and these really refined high-end progression tracks, and just fell away from it because there are other games that out there that have existed for longer and that just have more content. But I think they're doing the right thing by keeping that game going and keeping it updated, and eventually it will,
I was impressed.
Evolve, but
I stopped playing it pretty close after buying it, and I was like, did I just waste like $40? That's kind of how I thought with New World, because it was cheaper, which was nice than like most MMOs.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it wasn't $60. And then I came back to it like a month or two ago with a friend, and we played it, and I was like, they've done a lot. Like, they've made it a lot better. Like, a lot of just quality of life improvements too. That's, again, like, it's funny now talking about Everquest, because I feel like if I played Everquest now, I'd be like, what is wrong with these people? Why did they make it this way? I'd be so upset. I complain when an enemy takes like a minute to respawn, not days, So
Right. Yeah. I think this we're getting to a point where the World of Warcraft's like shadow is finally starting to dissipate. And I think that is a very good thing, because there actually are a ton. I really don't like it when people say MMORPGs are dead, which is a very common sort of thing in the community. It's like, oh, they're dead. Oh, there's no MMORPGs. There are a ton of MMORPGs out there. More, let me tell you, I was playing them, in the early 90s or the mid to late 90s and 2000. There's way more MMORPGs that you can play right now today than you could play then. Way more, and they're way better. And we are finally getting to a point where there's kind of this greater variety of games that you can choose from, because they don't all have to be World of Warcraft to work. There's a lot of different ways you can go about it. You can Kickstarter it. You can have sort of a small launch. And you have like 2,000 players playing, and if you've got like 10 developers, maybe that works for you. There's new games like Embers Adrift. Have you heard of that one? It's like this really, it's like this super hardcore game where basically just everything destroys you unless you're in a group of 3 people. And it's not very popular, but they seem to be making it work. There's another one that launched, Glorious Victus, I think it is, a PvP MMO, and it's only got like 1,000 players, but like they're making it work, it seems like. And as long as you can kind of make the cost of making the game match, what you're getting from your player base, then you're good. You got a business. And I think
we're finally have 10 million people to do that.
No, you don't. I think we're finally getting to the point where some of these smaller sort of projects are viable and can be an ongoing sort of game, even though they're not super popular and have really niche audiences.
That's a beautiful. I feel like you just put a perfect bow on the conversation. The hope of the MMO.
Wrap it up for you,
Matthew. Yeah, you did. So we would love to have you on again. This was wonderful. Like, I had so much fun, and it was great talking to you.
Yeah, it's always great to talk about this kind of stuff. It's awesome.
You already kind of soft launched that you're working on an Everquest book, so we won't go too much more into that. But do you have anything you'd like to plug, like where people could find your stuff? I know I mentioned your YouTube channel, Computer Gaming, yesterday, but is there anywhere else people could check out your writing?
So besides the YouTube channel, if you look up mattontech.me, that's my little website, and it has some links to places that I've written for my both tech journalism and gaming journalism. One thing I would like to shout out, which just got published today, was I have a history of Flight Simulator that got published on IEEE Spectrum this morning. So, and I was working on that for a long time. So check that out. It's IEEE Spectrum, IEEE Spectrum. And that kind of goes through the entire history of Flight Simulator at a high level. Some interesting tidbits from that article. They were working pretty hard on a prototype of Flight Simulator for the original Xbox.
Oh,
and apparently it was playing. They had it playable, but to some extent, but they had issues getting the controls hammered out. So that never ended up actually getting released. And that ended up probably being a pretty significant contributor as to why the franchise kind of was temporarily canceled there from around the 2008 to 2020 period. I think 2020 is when the new one came out.
Wow.
Flight Simulator.
Yeah.
Well,
so there's a lot of interesting information in there about the game.
I think we just found our next topic to have you on to talk about. This is really exciting.
Yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about Flight Simulator, which is a game. It was one of the first games I played because it was bundled with my computer. With the first computer that we got in 96, because it was like, wow, here's an awesome 3D game for Windows, and you've got Windows, so we're going to show you how cool Windows is. Play flight simulator, and I did. I think it ran about 20 FPS. But
what kind of computer did you get in 96? Because I feel like I had Flight Simulator on a Gateway computer in 1996, like the 90s.
I had a
era.
Sony.
You had a Sony? Okay,
yeah.
maybe it was just bundled with Windows. They're like, here you go.
I think they bundled it super widely. Yeah, because Microsoft had just acquired them, and I think they bundled it super widely.
Well, Matthew, we like to end our podcast with a little segment called What You've Been Playing. And we just talk about what we've been playing. And because you're the guest, you get to go first. And you mentioned EverQuest P99, but you'd have to explain, if someone that's listening doesn't know, definitely not a host, what the P99 means in EverQuest.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something I've been playing quite a bit lately with a few friends. And so EverQuest P99 is Project 1999 is the full name, and it's an emulated server, which is restricted to the first 3 expansions. Or was it 2? I think it might be 2. Kunark and Velis. And I think that's it. So it's kind of a super classic kind of experience. It doesn't have any of the later convenience features or level cap increases that really got crazy. I think level was not now up to like 140 or something in EverQuest. So it's a very old school experience. But it's super popular, actually. I mean, there's usually about 700 people on the blue server and 1,200 people on the green server on a typical night. So I'd really encourage, if you want an old school MMORPG experience, you can check that out. Or you can just you can also play EverQuest, just regular EverQuest. It's still around. They do have time locked progression servers. So it's definitely worth checking out the live version as well.
Do you play other games other than MMOs, or are you mostly an MMO kind of person?
What else have I been playing lately? I've been playing something more modern. I've been playing Ghost of Tsushima. I just started playing that. That is a really good game. Really good combat. I have to say, they really nailed the feeling of being a samurai in that game. I was not expecting, like, everyone said it was great, and I was like, I don't know, how good can it really be? I mean, I've played a lot of like third person action RPG kind of games like that. Like, how good can it really be? It's really good. It is really good. So
it's a PlayStation exclusive, right?
It is, yeah.
It is. Okay. I wonder if that one will come out on PC. I hope it will.
I hope it will too. I hope it will too. I bet it would look even better, because in some regards you can kind of tell it's like a late PS4 release, like in some of the foliage and stuff. It's like, it looks beautiful, but at the same time it's kind of like, clearly there were some technical limits that they were dealing with. So it'd be nice to see that on PC.
Yeah. Well, Tyler, what have you been playing this week?
This week, most of my time is still on World of Warcraft, because we're in it deep. I'm trying to get to. I want to finish the whole raid on normal, maybe on heroic, get that ahead of the curve achievement. But I just don't. It takes so much time. Like, you spend 2 minutes fighting the boss, and then we spend 10 minutes like getting ready to fight the boss again, right? Like, because people drop, or
that's still a problem even today.
Yeah, that's like my least favorite part. Like, I'm just like, let's just run it again. Like, in the amount of time we spent talking about it, we could have done it 5 more times and probably got it. Anyway, that's my beef with World of Warcraft right now. But that's more of a person beef than a game beef. But that's it. While my power was out, I put another couple hours into Crisis Core Reunion because I have a little handheld PC that I can play games on. I do have a Steam Deck. I'm not playing it on Steam Deck though, but that's what I put a couple hours into yesterday while my power was out, and that's kind of it. Mike, what about you?
No big deal. This is my obscure game I play all the time, Matthew. I got 100% achievements in Jurassic World Evolution 2. I am the ultimate park sim designer.
Very nice.
I also, I cheesed the majority of those achievements in sandbox mode, and it took me like 10 minutes, but still I got 100%. And then I also been playing a lot more Stardew Valley this week, because I'm just back in it again. I can't stop myself. I realized I never romanced a character in that game, and I feel like that's like half the game. So I just am trying to do that right now. But then I'm romancing Emily, the blue-haired character, and I'm breaking Clint's heart, who's the person who clearly loves her. I'm gonna take it away. But
that game could be that. Yeah, that game could be. It could be kind of harsh in some of those relationship arcs.
Oh my
sometimes.
gosh. Well, there was that moment. So I just got the romance scene where Emily's about to tell me she has feelings for me, and Clint walks back in and he's like, "Oh," and he says, "Congrats, Mike," and then walks out. Like, oh. But then there's a character named Kent who is a war veteran, right? And then the spring festival takes place in the field that's like usually inaccessible except on this one day. And I go talk to him in the field and he goes, "This field's too open." Like he makes like a weird PTSD like comment. And I'm like, wow, this game has so much going on to it. And that's why it's even more impressive that one person made it to me, is it's like that each character has so many different things going with it. So I'm kind of still obsessed with that game. I need to get back into The Witcher 3, something I've been trying to do. Yeah, and I also beat Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. I did finally beat it after doing the episode.
I saw
last
that
week.
you were working on that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how exactly I saw that, but I definitely want to go play that game because I remember that from back in the day, and I remember it was like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. It was like, oh man, we're making Might and Magic edgy. We're making it,
yeah,
we're making it super edgy, and but I don't really recall much about the game, so I was like, I wanted to go back and play that.
Well, the majority of the game is kicking people into spikes. That's about 75% of the game, I would say, and I love it.
That sounds cool. Yeah,
no, it's really fun. The story is weird, but I did play so I played it for the podcast, and then I had an issue where because there's no cloud save, right? So when I went on the road for comedy, I couldn't actually play the game. So I cheated and I did console commands, but that broke the game, so I couldn't play all the levels all the way through. So then when I came home, we recorded the episode, and then that night I just like powered through a bunch of it, and I beat it in like a couple sittings. But it's pretty good. Like it makes me hope that they'd bring something back in this kind of weird style where you could like use the environment to defeat enemies, because I think it's really fun. And we actually had some really great recommendations on our Discord for me for other games like that. So
okay, cool.
That is not dead as far as like a genre goes. So that makes me pretty happy. But yeah, that's what I've been playing this week. If you want to reach out to us, you can send us an email. You can go to codexpodcast.net. That's our website I made. Our email's there. Our Twitters are there now. Our Trello boards are there now. So you can see all the games that Tyler and I still need to play that we just have this pile of shame together. There's also a contact form on the site, so you can actually just send us an email straight through there if you want to do it that way. But with that, though, this was a great episode. Thank you again, Matthew, for being on. It's been so much fun.
It's been super fun. Thanks for having me on. I always like to talk about MMORPGs and game history in general. So, I was listening to your podcast recently, and I was like, yeah, I think I'll send an email out and
thanks for reaching out.
Thanks for doing that. This has been so much fun.
It's been so great. All right, Tyler, do you want to say bye to everybody?
Yeah, sure. Goodbye, everybody.